Good evening and welcome to the DebtCircle Sundown Brief. I am Leela, bringing you today's key updates from the Indian debt and fixed income markets for the 10th of June 2026. Let us begin with the top 5 highest yield listed corporate bond transactions. Unifins Capital India Limited recorded a yield of 17.25% with a trade value of 40 lakh rupees. Akara Capital Advisors Private Limited recorded a yield of 17.22% with a trade value of 46.40 lakh rupees. Another bond from Akara Capital Advisors Private Limited recorded a yield of 15.90% with a trade value of 75 lakh rupees. Muthoot Capital Services Limited recorded a yield of 14.99% with a trade value of 0.03 lakh rupees. Crazy Bee Services Limited recorded a yield of 14.95% with a trade value of 0.50 lakh rupees. Moving to the top 5 highest yield unlisted corporate bond transactions. EARC Trust Series 453 recorded a yield of 20.00% with a trade value of 6,691.40 lakh rupees. Reliance Capital Limited recorded a yield of 16.84% with a trade value of 20,000 lakh rupees. Mpocket Financial Services Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.75% with a trade value of 50 lakh rupees. Apex Homes Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.00% with a trade value of 3,534.27 lakh rupees. Bhumika Shopping Centre India Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.00% with a trade value of 125 lakh rupees. Now, let us look at mutual fund debt transactions. Gross purchases stood at 27,829.94 crore rupees. Gross sales stood at 31,388.37 crore rupees. Net investment stood at negative 3,558.43 crore rupees. Month-to-date net investment for June stood at negative 32,404.140 crore rupees. Turning to foreign portfolio investor debt market activity. Under the general limit category, gross purchases stood at 675.60 crore rupees. Under the voluntary retention route or VRR, gross purchases stood at 104.23 crore rupees. Under the fully accessible route or FAR, gross purchases stood at 2,623.02 crore rupees. Gross sales under the general limit category stood at 359.39 crore rupees. Gross sales under VRR stood at 69.79 crore rupees. Gross sales under FAR stood at 826.20 crore rupees. Net investment under the general limit category stood at 316.21 crore rupees. Net investment under VRR stood at 34.44 crore rupees. Net investment under FAR stood at 1,796.82 crore rupees. Month-to-date net investment for June stood at 2,055.83 crore rupees under the general limit category, 2,733.79 crore rupees under VRR, and 10,349.98 crore rupees under FAR. Calendar year 2026 year-to-date investment stood at negative 1,339 crore rupees under the general limit category, negative 218 crore rupees under VRR, and 24,963 crore rupees under FAR. Moving to money market rates. The call rate stood at 5.28%. Tri-party repo stood at 5.18%. Basket repo stood at 5.20%. Special repo stood at 5.09%. Now for India government bond yields. The 1-year yield stood at 5.97%. The 3-year yield stood at 6.31%. The 5-year yield stood at 6.56%. The 7-year yield stood at 6.80%. The 9-year yield stood at 6.92%. The 10-year yield stood at 6.91%. The 15-year yield stood at 7.27%. The 30-year yield stood at 7.56%. Looking at Treasury bill yields and auction cutoffs, the 91-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.56%. The 182-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.73%. The 364-day Treasury bill yield stood at 6.03%. Now, liquidity indicators. Net liquidity injected stood at negative 1,80,221 crore rupees. Standing deposit facility, or SDF, stood at 1,80,346 crore rupees. Marginal standing facility, or MSF, stood at 125 crore rupees. Moving to MIBOR OIS rates. The 1-year rate stood at 6.03%. The 2-year rate stood at 6.19%. The 3-year rate stood at 6.30%. The 5-year rate stood at 6.45%. Modified MIFOR rates were as follows. 2 years stood at 6.72%, 3 years stood at 6.73%, 4 years stood at 0.00%, 5 years stood at 6.95%. Turning to currency markets, the US dollar to Indian rupee rate stood at 95.39 compared with 95.27 previously. The euro to Indian rupee rate stood at 110.11 compared with 110.26 previously. The British pound to Indian rupee rate stood at 127.66 compared with 127.70 previously. The Japanese yen to Indian rupee rate stood at 0.59 compared with 0.60 previously. The Chinese yuan to Indian rupee rate stood at 14.07 compared with 14.12 previously. Moving to commodities and market indices. Gold, 24 carat with 99.9% purity, stood at 14,886 rupees per 10 grams compared with 15,316 rupees previously. Silver stood at 2,500 rupees per 10 grams compared with 2,600 rupees previously. Crude oil stood at $93.07 per barrel compared with $92.79 previously. The Sensex closed at 73,983.18 compared with 73,918.76 previously. The Nifty closed at 23,214.95 compared with 23,242.10 previously. These market levels are as of the 9th of June 2026. Finally, let us look at India's primary corporate bond issuances. Kotak Mahindra Prime Limited announced an issuance of 400 crore rupees with multiple tranches ranging from 23 to 35 months in tenure, offering coupon rates ranging from 7.05% to 8.05%. HDB Financial Services Limited announced an issuance of 505 crore rupees with multiple tranches ranging from 35 to 60 months in tenure, offering coupon rates ranging from 7.75% to 8.28%. The issue is rated AAA by Care Ratings Limited and AAA by CRISIL Ratings Limited. RDC Concrete India Limited announced an issuance of 35 crore rupees with a tenure of 31 months and a coupon rate of 11.00%. The issue is rated A by Acquite Ratings and Research Limited. That concludes today's DebtCircle Sundown brief for the 10th of June 2026. Thank you for joining us. I'm Leela. Have a pleasant evening and stay connected with DebtCircle for more insights from the debt markets.